Hey everyone, welcome to the Peter Attia Drive. I'm your host, Peter Attia. The drive is a result of my hunger for optimizing performance, health, longevity, critical thinking, along with a few other obsessions along the way. I've spent the last several years working with some of the most successful, top-performing individuals in the world, and this podcast is my attempt to synthesize what I've learned along the way to help you live a higher quality, more fulfilling life. If you enjoy this podcast, you can find more information on today's episode and other topics at peterattiamd.com. Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of The Drive. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk about why we don't run ads on this podcast and why instead we've chosen to rely entirely on listener support. If you're listening to this, you probably already know, but the two things I care most about professionally are how to live longer and how to live better. I have a complete fascination and obsession with this topic. I practice it professionally, and I've seen firsthand how access to information is basically all people need to make better decisions and improve the quality of their lives. Curating and sharing this knowledge is not easy, and even before starting the podcast, that became clear to me. The sheer volume of material published in this space is overwhelming. I'm fortunate to have a great team that helps me continue learning and sharing this information with you. To take one example, our show notes are in a league of their own. In fact, we now have a full-time person that is dedicated to producing those, and the feedback has mirrored this. So all of this raises a natural question. How will we continue to fund the work necessary to support this? As you probably know, the tried and true way to do this is to sell ads. But after a lot of contemplation, that model just doesn't feel right to me for a few reasons. Now, the first and most important of these is trust. I'm not sure how you could trust me if I'm telling you about something when you know I'm being paid by the company that makes it to tell you about it. Another reason selling ads doesn't feel right to me is because I just know myself. I have a really hard time advocating for something that I'm not absolutely nuts for. So if I don't feel that way about something, I don't know how I can talk about it enthusiastically. So instead of selling ads, I've chosen to do what a handful of others have proved can work over time, and that is to create a subscriber support model for my audience. This keeps my relationship with you both simple and honest. If you value what I'm doing, you can become a member and support us at whatever level works for you. In exchange, you'll get the benefits above and beyond what's available for free. It's that simple. It's my goal to ensure that no matter what level you choose to support us at, you will get back more than you give. So, for example, members will receive full access to the exclusive show notes, including other things that we plan to build upon, such as the downloadable transcripts for each episode. These are useful beyond just the podcast, especially given the technical nature of many of our shows. Members also get exclusive access to listen to and participate in the regular Ask Me Anything episodes. That means asking questions directly into the AMA portal and also getting to hear these podcasts when they come out. Lastly, and this is something I'm really excited about, I want my supporters to get the best deals possible on the products that I love. And as I said, we're not taking ad dollars from anyone, but instead what I'd like to do is work with companies who make the products that I already love and would already talk about for free, and have them pass savings on to you. Again, the podcast will remain free to all, but my hope is that many of you will find enough value in, one, the podcast itself, and two, the additional content exclusive for members to support us at a level that makes sense for you. I want to thank you for taking a moment to listen to this. If you learn from and find value in the content I produce, please consider supporting us directly by signing up for a monthly subscription. My guest this week is Iñigo San Millán. Iñigo is an assistant professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, where his areas of research focus on exercise metabolism, nutrition, sports performance, overtraining, diabetes, cancer, and critical care. And I realize at least one of you at this moment is thinking, how in God's name can one person study all of those things? And the answer is, if you come at it through the lens of the mitochondria, it turns out you can have a breadth of focus that covers all those things. And of course, that's exactly what Iñigo does, is he studies mitochondrial performance and mitochondrial efficiency. And it's based on that the moment he and I met a year ago, it was a sort of love at first sight. And we've been geeking out together ever since. Iñigo has had a profound impact on my training, the way I talk to my patients about exercise, and the way I've thought about longevity through the lens of mitochondrial performance. He is an internationally renowned applied physiologist. He's worked for at least 20 years with many professional teams, elite athletes across all sports. He himself is a remarkable athlete, which we barely get into. He's so modest and unassuming. He currently works with a number of professional cycling teams at the highest level, including at the level of the Tour de France. He's pioneered a number of things that we get into here, everything from using high-frequency ultrasound to assess glycogen levels to, more importantly, ways in which we can use biopsies at the invasive level and blood tests at the less invasive level to draw on the insights of mitochondrial performance. It would take me an hour to simply explain the treasure trove of stuff we explore in this episode, so I'm not even going to try to say what we get into, other than if you're interested in mitochondria, if you're interested in fitness, if you're interested in exercise, if you're interested in metabolic health, all of the above, I think you just need to listen to this one and take my word for it without seeing the running commentary. The show notes, of course, will be especially important for this one because some of this stuff just is better explained through pictures than words. And of course, there will be a nice, effective table of contents there. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Iñigo. Iñigo, thank you so much for making time to sit down today in your new office here.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's my pleasure and honor that you're here with us at the University of Colorado at the School of Medicine.
I emailed my team. I emailed Nick and Bob and a couple of the guys today when I was on the way over here. I was on the plane and I was reviewing my notes, and I thought, I am so excited to sit down with you today and Rick tomorrow, because we've had so many kind of off-the-cuff sidebar conversations about mitochondria, mitochondrial function, health, efficiency, et cetera. And it's sort of like we never have enough time. It's like 15 minutes here and 12 minutes there and an email here and an email there. But it was in preparing for this, the team helped me really kind of put a lot of my thoughts together. But I think before we kind of get into the really hardcore stuff around mitochondria, which is something that I think anybody who's interested in health at any level, whether it's really at the deep cellular level or just at the level of I want to live as long as I can, as healthy as I can, everybody sort of has a sense that all roads point to the mitochondria. But your path to getting there, to me, is particularly interesting because it starts with looking at athletes. And you yourself, even though you downplay it a lot, you were quite the athlete growing up. So you grew up in Spain, and what sports did you play?
Yeah, I grew up in Spain, and I played for Real Madrid at the academy for 6 years. And I was always very passionate about sport. Then when I turned 16, I discovered cycling, and that's what I changed sports. So my dad still thinks that was the dumbest decision of my life. But
is that true statistically? Would a child growing up in Spain who's already in the feeder program for Real Madrid, would they have a better chance of having a career as a professional football player than a professional cyclist?
That's hard to say, but when you're already at that age in Real Madrid, you can be getting to the top team is very difficult, obviously, but definitely be a feeder to other smaller teams. That's a higher possibility, but you never know, but you have to follow your passion, I guess. And I followed it, and I changed to cycling, and I got to race professionally for 2 years at a low level. So I always say that I admit it, I'm a truncated and a frustrated professional athlete because I never got to the top. But that said, I learned a lot, and it's been a school of life all my life. Since I was 9 years old, I've been in the high level of competition up until today on the other side of the table, working with athletes. And that's what I became very familiar with, everything related to the elite sport and that everything that involves.
I don't think most people who have not themselves been on a bicycle and trying to do something at a reasonably high level can appreciate that even being a professional, quote unquote, low level, I assume what you're saying by that is you were not necessarily on a team that was even going to go to the big grand tours and such. But I still think most people don't understand the level, how much higher that is above a general fitness athlete type of thing. So when you were at that level, what was your specialty? Were you a time trialist? Were you, you looked too tall to be a climber, but who knows what you weighed back then?
Yeah, I was very skinny though.
You're taller than me.
I'm like 5'11".
Okay, so you're an inch taller.
But I used to be 143, 145 pounds.
Oh, wow.
So
okay.
I was very skinny. So I used to be a good climber. I was good overall, but better as a climber. But yeah, I appreciate it now when I see people who are category 1s or 2s or 3s as a cyclist or so, that their fitness level is very good. That definitely my fitness level was better, but at the same time, there is like a whole world between my fitness level and what the Tour de France guys have.
It is unbelievable. When I was sort of going through category 5, 4, 3, 2, by some metrics, I could maybe time trial at the level of a category 2, 3, but of course my climbing and sprinting and everything else would have been like a category 4. And you realize that the guy who's category 1, the guys I used to train with who are collegiate athletes who were exceptional at category 1, they're still not even pro. There's still a step between them and a domestic pro. And then the domestic pro to get from that level to a European pro, and then the European pro to get to a major team, and then to be on a major team, and the difference between the GC contender and everybody else. We're talking about log orders of ability. It's not subtle.
No, and I have all the data from all these years collecting the data, and I know very well the physiological parameters typical of a top junior athlete or category 3, category 2, 1, domestic pro, average pro tour cyclist, and best of the best. And the difference is amazing. They're very significant. You can really categorize people accordingly.
We're going to come back and start to talk about professional cycling and things. And there's so many things I want to talk about, because I think for also the person who's not immediately wed to the sport might too easily want to dismiss the accolades of these athletes and the physiologic prowess as simply, well, you know, those guys all use drugs. And while that's probably true at some level with respect to some drugs and certainly a certain class of athletes, it in no way diminishes what their physiology looks like completely off drugs. So we'll come back to all that. But going to you, so after 2 years at a professional level, what made you decide, I'm not going to continue doing this, I'm going to pursue my education and the other things that you've gone on to do?
I realized that it's very difficult and you need to be at the right place at the right time, at the right moment, and that different planets need to be aligned. It is not just the best always get up there to call it destiny, call it whatever, but a lot of things have to happen to become a pro, and they were not on my side. But at the same time, I needed to make a decision, either trying to get an education that can not assure me, but at least give me some future professionally speaking outside the sport, or try to go for the sport where the planets were not aligned. I didn't know if I could even make it, and it would take that sacrifice. So that's what I decided, I think this is not good for me. And then as I was studying also, I had a good possibility of doing a very good internship at a top, if not the top, sports medicine clinic in Spain. In fact, the famous PRP therapy was born in that clinic.
Oh, wow.
And that's where I said, I had a good possibility to start internship, and then became a part-time job. And at that time, I said, okay, I'm just going to stay here and continue.
And how long have you been here at the University of Colorado?
11 years.
Okay. Now, you and I met through an interesting circumstance. It's a funny story. I don't know if you remember the very first time, but I had just flown into Abu Dhabi, and I think I came straight from the airport to the training facility, and it was like 11 o'clock at night or something, and you put me right on the bike, and we did a VO2 max test, and which anybody who's done a VO2 max test on a bike knows there's nothing very pleasant about it. You've got this mask that is incredibly restrictive. I hadn't done one since I stopped cycling, so that was probably 5 years or 6 years. And then I think you weren't happy with the air mixer because we were getting weird numbers, and it was at some point, I think, when I hit about 50 milliliters per milligram per kilogram, we sort of said that's enough. And it was a good thing because I don't think I had much more. It's amazing how much you lose when you stop training that zone.
Yeah.
I never thought there could be a day when my VO2 max could be below 50. Yeah. Like I thought it'll be 50 when I'm 100, right?
Yeah.
That's not true.
Yeah.
It really falls away.
Yeah, it falls apart. Yeah.
So I would be surprised if I could hit 55 today, actually. But we connected immediately because it was a great point in my life where I was sort of looking for direction as a former, I don't even want to use the word athlete to describe myself, but as a person who formerly took training very seriously to now someone who was trying to think about reshaping my training around longevity. It was a perfect collision of ideas because I was sort of in search of what to really focus on. And what we immediately clicked over was your protocol for Zone 2 training, which you were instituting heavily with the UAE team and other folks that you were training there. And the rest is history. I mean, it's really completely shaped the way I think about using this type of training as a way to improve mitochondrial function and as a way to test it. I almost think at this point for the listener, we should pause for a moment and explain these energy systems, because so much of what I want to ask you about and so much of what your research focuses on assumes a level of understanding I don't want to take for granted. So maybe explain for people what aerobic metabolism means.
Okay, so there are different energy systems, and those energy systems, they're also used by different muscle fibers in the muscle. There are different conditions, like the aerobic condition and anaerobic condition. We tend to believe that the immense majority of activity that we do is aerobic. We tend to believe that any hard effort is anaerobic, and therefore the concept of anaerobic threshold. But actually, even what we call the anaerobic threshold is an aerobic activity. So the majority of the efforts that we do are in an anaerobic environment, except for when you do a sprint or when you do maybe like a 1 minute maximal. Outside that, the majority of the activities that we do are in the aerobic state. Then what changes is the fuels that you use to produce energy. So at the end of the day, what we want to do is to contract the muscles, and not only to contract them as fast and as forceful as possible, but what we want also is to do this as efficiently as possible. So, for example, for a marathon race or for a 1,500-meter race, you need to calculate when you pull the trigger and go for it, and then when you have to deploy the maximum efficiency that you have. So you need to be very efficient metabolically speaking. So the fuels are very important for that. So the main fuels that we use for exercise are the fatty acids and glucose. And those are oxidized or burned in the different skeletal muscle fibers that we have. So we have the slow twitch muscle fibers and the fast twitch muscle fibers. The fast twitch muscle fibers are divided in two. The type 1A and type 2B, if you will. Some people call them type 2X as well, but there are two kinds of muscle fibers.
And I just want to interject for a moment because I know a lot of people listening to this have heard the term fast twitch and slow twitch, and the assumption is that they twitch at different speeds, but really it's that they twitch with a different force. And the speed is referring to how quickly they fatigue, not the speed with which they fire. So when you're talking about a type 1 or a slow twitch muscle fiber, it's just a less forceful fiber. Whereas a type 2 fiber, and as you said, they're divided into A's and B's, with each firing, with each time the muscle fiber fires, there are more motor end plates, and therefore it's generating more force. But the trade-off is it's going to be more quick to fatigue. Mm-hmm. And why is that? Why does it fatigue faster? Because it comes down to what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's because metabolically they're more stressed. The way we recruit muscle fibers obeys a sequential pattern that is very similar to the stick gears of a manual car. So you first start and you go in first gear, and as the RPMs go up, then you get to a point you get to the red zone. So that car cannot keep up with that first gear. You need to shift to second gear, and you speed up and the RPMs go higher, and then eventually you need to shift to third gear. This is very similar to what happens at the skeletal muscle. The type 1 muscle fibers, slow twitch, they can produce ATP, which is the energy coin, the classic that we always hear about, which is what elicits that muscle contraction. So at low exercise intensities, we don't need to contract the muscles nearly as forceful nor as fast as when we do high intensity.
Meaning we don't need to go back and keep firing and keep firing and keep firing. Yeah,
exactly. And for that, we don't need to generate ATP as fast as we do at higher intensities. And it's about ATP generation, that's exercise intensity. So at low exercise intensities, those slow twitch muscle fibers or type 1 muscle fibers, they are very well designed to use an energy that is good enough to provide ATP, and yet you can do this for a very long time. And that's the diesel gasoline, and that is the fatty acids. However, as exercise intensity increases, the necessity to produce ATP at a higher rate increases as well. And it gets to a point where fatty acids alone are not enough to produce ATP. And therefore, you need another energy system, and that energy system is the glucose, which is a faster energy system, which, going back to the analogy of the car, is like if we had, imagine a car with two tanks. One is gasoline, and the other one, or regular gasoline, and the other one is diesel gasoline. So if you were to go from here to Denver to Kansas, where everything is flat and you don't need to accelerate or go fast, you would try to be more efficient and would try to use then the diesel gasoline. It's more economical. You get more mileage per gallon. But if you want to go to the mountains and you need to accelerate fast, that diesel might not do the trick. You need extra acceleration, so that's where you would utilize the glucose. And that's the regular gasoline, which is like the glucose for the muscles. And that's kind of how the bioenergetics of the muscles kind of principles start.
I like the way you've explained it, and I did a much worse job, I think, probably 7 years ago. I wrote a blog post on this. The insight I was trying to get across, I don't know if I did, was that we should not think of aerobic and anaerobic as with or without oxygen, which is sort of the way people are taught in high school biology. Aerobic means in the presence of oxygen. Anaerobic means not in the presence of oxygen. No, it's always in the presence of oxygen. It comes down to the speed with which the muscle is demanding ATP. Aerobic means you're generating ATP at a rate that is slow enough that all of the metabolic demands can be met through mitochondrial oxidation of hopefully mostly fatty acids, but even glucose. Anaerobic just means, exactly as you said, the demand for ATP has now exceeded the capacity of the mitochondria. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and even the cytosol. So the cytosol, which is part of the cell, that's where you can oxidize glucose there into pyruvate, and that pyruvate doesn't enter the mitochondria, but you produce lactate, but you produce energy and ATP there. And that can perfectly be still aerobic capacity. And my colleague George Brooks from Berkeley, he's been studying lactate since the 80s, and he's the one who proved it, that you can produce lactate under fully aerobic conditions, not necessarily in the mitochondria, but in the cytosol. However, when the ATP demands even exceed the cytosolic production of ATP, that's where you need to use the ATP that is already stored in the muscles. You just don't have time to synthesize it. You need just to use it. And that's why the body stores very, very minimal amounts of ATP, and that's what you develop in a sprint, or you use in a sprint. But you need to resynthesize it very fast. That's the pure anaerobic. You don't need any energy systems. And that goes also that of the confusion that is out there too.
And are you saying this is distinct from the creatine phosphate system?
Yeah, you can use a creatine phosphate as well. So you can have ATP and you can use the creatine phosphate systems. Those two, they don't need oxygen necessarily. Anything else can be under fully aerobic conditions, like even cytosolic production of ATP in the cytosol without mitochondrial oxidation necessarily, can happen under fully aerobic conditions. And in fact, that's what we also call aerobic glycolysis. And in other areas of biomedical research or medicine, it's called the Warburg effect, which is now a lot of people into cancer talk about it. The Warburg effect is the production of lactate or the utilization of glucose in the cytosol, not in the mitochondria, but in the cytosol outside the mitochondria for production of energy.
Well, I want to come back to the Warburg effect, but you brought up Brooks, and there's a paper that the two of you wrote together somewhat recently. I think it was maybe 2018, if not this year, but it's actually, I'm in the process of writing a book, as you may recall. And in the exercise chapter, I actually really explore that paper that you guys wrote, which looked at the zone 2 efficiency of world-class cyclists, recreational athletes, and people with diabetes. That's an unbelievable paper. And that's an unbelievable example of, I think, the clinical applicability of what we're talking about. So to put it in context, when we got talking back in Abu Dhabi last year about this, I remember you saying, and I'm paraphrasing, so you should clarify if I'm not saying it correctly, that your interest in athletes is in large part due to your interest in diabetes, because if you want to understand how to fix an example of arguably the most defective mitochondria, why not at least study what the perfect mitochondria look like? Is that a fair statement?
Exactly, yes. And that's kind of what I'm trying to bring to the table. In the elite athletes have the perfect metabolism, and mitochondria is at the epicenter of metabolism and health, as you said earlier. There are no other population in the planet with the mitochondria of elite endurance athletes.
I was about to say, yeah, you said elite athletes. I would go even sharper. It really, in my mind, comes down to cyclists and runners.
Yes, and triathletes. Yeah.
Even more than swimmers because of just the duration of it. It's these people who can go out and function at their anaerobic threshold for hours. And that's only really found in two sports.
Oh, yes. And that's what we see that even with an elite athlete, and I work with many elite athletes, you compare them and there's a huge difference.
I guess I should add one. I think cross-country skiers are probably at that
those
level
ones
as
too.
well.
Yeah, so this population is the population in the planet with the healthiest mitochondria. So that's what I call perfection. And that's what I try to bring to the table, that in order to study other diseases where mitochondrial dysfunction is at the epicenter as well, we need to understand what perfection is in order to understand imperfection. And what we see in people with type 2 diabetes, for example, they are on the opposite metabolic pole of what a world-class cyclist or runner is. So by knowing the mechanisms of why that metabolism in these world-class athletes works, we can get to understand the imperfection or the imperfect metabolic pathways and potentially develop diagnostic tools and even therapeutics for them, as well as prevention programs.
Yeah, and really cancer and type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance as part of a spectrum do represent two very common findings in the population. So if you look at what percentage of the United States population either has cancer or is insulin resistant or has metabolic syndrome and or type 2 diabetes or fatty liver disease, all of these things which are part of a continuum, you were talking about half the country basically that has some form of dysfunction in the mitochondria. In the case of cancer, we can debate how much of that is a genetic insult versus other things. But because I want to talk so much about that, I want to go back and understand perfection a bit more. So there are lots of different ways people codify energy systems. When I was cycling, we used 7 zones because that was Andy Coggan's FTP-based energy system. You write about 6 zones, and others have talked about 5. But I want to talk about your 6 zones because one, I think they're a little easier to explain than the FTP-based ones, which if you don't know, if a functional threshold power number doesn't mean something to someone, then 7 energy systems based on it is harder to understand. How would you walk us through zones 1 through 6? What do they mean? Because when we start to talk about zone 2, I want people to understand the difference between the normal person and the super person and the sick person. So what is zone 1? What does that mean?
So that's from 25 years working with athletes and also my experience from being a former athlete and being obsessed with training and all these things. That's it led me to develop this. I'm not saying that they're the right things and maybe in 10 years I change my mind or someone else comes with different things that are better. But that's what I have right now at least. So I do this along with the muscle fiber recruitment pattern and the energy systems. So the type 1 muscle fibers, we know also that because they're the ones who oxidize fat, burn the fat very well, they have the highest mitochondrial density and content because fat can only be burned in the mitochondria. Type 2 muscle fibers, especially the first type of muscle fibers, type 2, the type 2As, they have lower mitochondrial function because...
Lower mitochondrial function or density?
Density, because they don't necessarily need to oxidize glucose in the mitochondria. They can do it in the cytosol of the cell, and therefore produce lactate, but they can produce ATP fast. So those muscle fibers, they don't contain as much mitochondria. And then the second type of muscle, slow fast twitch muscle fiber, the type 2B or 2X, that is the one that is the pure anaerobic, if you will. And that is the one that barely has mitochondria, has very minimal mitochondria. So starting with that, that's where I start breaking down the zones. So the zone 1 would represent the minimum stimulation the muscle fibers receive. It's just pure contraction. That's what would you do on a recovery day or recovery mode. You have very low exercise intensity and you burn a little bit of fat mainly. And that's what we see also. We look at also fat and carbohydrate utilization. Scientifically, we call it fat and carbohydrate oxidation rates, how many grams per minute of carbohydrate and fat you burn. So we know that at these intensities, you burn mostly fat, although you also burn a little bit of carbohydrates, which we can go through that.
Yeah, I want to come back to it because there's such an interesting clinical observation that I've seen over the past 5 or 6 years. And your recent paper with Brooks, just hammered it home in a much more rigorous way. So yeah, we are going to come back to RQ at rest as a harbinger of these other things that follow under distress.
Yeah, so that's the zone 1.
So just to put that in energy terms for people, you and I walking up the stairs, we were coming from the lobby, we're in zone 1.
Yeah.
Walking down the street.
Or if you are very fit and you go for a jog, very easy recovery day, that's your zone 1.
And then for the elite, give us an example. So if you took Meb or someone who's going to run a sub 2:10 marathon, you have a sense of how fast they could run and still be in zone 1? Someone who's used to running 445 to 450 miles, could their zone 1 be as fast as like a 7-minute mile?
Yeah, absolutely. You can see world-class athletes that their zone 1, it's my sprinting, for example. It's kind of what we see also in cyclists. The recovery day is 200 watts average. And for most mere mortals, 200 watts, they can do that for 15 minutes. You know?
I just wrote a post about this recently using it as an example. For people who ride a bike, 200 watts is about how fast it would take you to go 30 kilometers an hour without wind or without elevation. And that's certainly not all out, but that's pretty fast. And if you can imagine being able to ride at that level indefinitely without any metabolic consequence, that's what an elite athlete is doing. And that says nothing, by the way, about their weight. They're doing that at a body weight that is a fraction of most people. So,
yeah, that's what they call the coffee ride.
Yeah.
They go for a coffee or ice cream ride and it's chit-chat and they're like, it's unbelievable.
So zone 1, does lactate get produced?
It should not get produced. Well, we start from the base that there's always lactate produced in the body.
So if you were to poke my finger right now or poke your finger right now, we measure lactate in millimolar. What would you expect to measure in me or you?
You would be about 1 millimole.
Okay.
0.7 to 1 millimole. That's kind of like a standard resting levels in a healthy individual.
And in a normal person, so not an elite athlete, but sort of a recreational athlete, what's the highest lactate you'll typically measure in that person if you put them in a treadmill test or a...
It depends on the protocol that you do. If it's a very violent protocol or if it's a longer protocol, violent protocols, they produce more lactate. You might see 10, 12 millimoles, whether that protocol, let's say a 6 minutes maximal effort on a rowing machine, right? And the concept, for example. I've seen world-class rowers. It's a maximal effort with 20 millimoles of lactate. It's very rare. You see very easily 15, 16, 17. That's because, and we can talk about that later, their glycolytic capacity, it's off the charts. Whereas people who, they're not elite athletes, it's for them in that same protocol, it's more difficult to go over 12 millimoles, 10 millimoles, because their glycolytic capacity is not so good as the one that the elite athletes have.
And sometimes elite athletes have the opposite issue, which is they don't make much lactate at all. They're so efficient. I've actually discussed this with Lance Armstrong after I erroneously had been on a podcast and made the case that he had a very high lactate tolerance. You were talking about it one day informally, and he said, no, it's actually the opposite. I would barely produce any lactate. He was usually producing less lactate than others. And again, this was when everybody's on the same drug or everybody's off the same drug. I mean, just genetically, there are some people who probably have more MCT, which we'll come back and talk to, and they become more efficient at it. But okay, so that gives us a sense that lactate will go from maybe 1 to 10 if you're a normal person, maybe 1 to 20. I actually measured
20 is difficult.
I measured a lactate of 24 in a friend of mine once.
Wow.
The highest I've ever measured in myself was 19.7.
Wow.
And that was only a 4-minute protocol.
Wow. Pretty impressive.
But also, I almost wonder, like, maybe I wasn't even in particularly great shape at the time, but I wonder if that same exertion under better fitness would have produced less lactate potentially, right?
It depends on the protocol, right? If the protocol stops there and what you intend is to produce, mobilize the glycolytic system to the maximum, you will produce a lot of lactate. If you want to continue and do a longer protocol, eventually you just cannot mobilize as much lactate, as much glycolytic system, because you have a little bit more of fatigue.
I think the difference between the really good people, when if I hit, and I've been above 18 maybe a dozen times, I'm done for half an hour. Yeah. Like I can barely get up off the floor to go and take a shower. Whereas this friend of mine who was at 24, I saw him go from 24 to 14 in a span of about 7 minutes and then jump in the pool and swim another race. And he's world class. So that's sort of the difference. I think the world class athlete can also clear the lactate much quicker than I can.
For sure. And that's what happens in the mitochondria and any other part of the body. Because one thing with lactate, we believe that it's a waste product. However, lactate is the most important, if not the most important, fuel for the body.
That's a profound statement.
Yes. And
I completely agree with you that lactate is not a waste product, but say more about that point.
So one of the things, the brain prefers to use lactate.
So I have heard this. Talk to me about the data on this front.
So my colleague George Brooks, who is lactate man, so yeah, he started in doing research with TBI, traumatic brain injury patients at UCLA. It's typical to give them glucose, and then when there's like a brain injury, well, the brain in the first place has evolved to use glucose as the main fuel. So when the brain is injured, they use more glucose. However, when it's injured, different metabolic pathways might be dysregulated. So what my colleague George Brooks suggested was to give them lactate. And he showed and he published they do better.
Better than beta-hydroxybutyrate, which also seems to be really beneficial in TBI patients for maybe a different reason than lactate, although it could be all similar, which is if you buy the argument, which I find favorable, that part of the insult of TBI is pyruvate dehydrogenase becomes resistant to insulin, that would explain why glucose becomes ineffective in those patients, and it would explain why beta-hydroxybutyrate can bypass it. And the same could be true of lactate,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
It's an alternative substrate that doesn't get limited through pyruvate dehydrogenase. Is that what you think is happening?
Yes, because it has its own transporter in the mitochondria and doesn't need PDH for that. It can enter the mitochondria directly for energy systems like hydroxybutyrate as well. But the thing is like lactate is a faster fuel. So the thing is like also...
Yeah, BHB is not a fast fuel.
Exactly, whereas lactate is as fast, if not faster, as glucose because it doesn't have to be processed, if you will.
Now, the listener might say, wait a minute, what are you guys talking about? Anyone who's ever done a lactate test knows how much pain you're in when your lactate level goes up. So one of the other, I think, misunderstandings is what's actually causing that pain. Because that's, I think, why so many of us have a negative association with lactate. It's not actually the lactate that's causing the physical discomfort that you feel when you're vomiting on the floor after a maximal lactate test. It's the hydrogen. So explain why that's the case and why we tend to confound the two.
I mean, there are many causes for pain or fatigue that in different hypotheses from the central fatigue to the peripheral fatigue. And it's very possible that both are interconnected at some point, and we don't know the exact mechanisms. At some point, the central fatigue calls for the brain to be the ruler, where the peripheral fatigue is what happens at the cellular level. So it is possible that there's like a crosstalk among both of them, and either the chicken or the egg, right? Either one of them says stop. But what we know is that, yeah, it's not lactate itself, but the hydrogen ions associated to lactate, they build up. One of the things that, and it's been research, they can decrease both the contractile capacity of the muscle fibers as well as the force by up to 50% or more. So that's one of the things that what we see is like the muscles, they cannot contract as fast or as forceful as before.
And this is an important point for people to understand, because if you haven't taken a physiology course, why would most people do so? It's also not obvious why you even need ATP to make your muscles contract. It's actually to unleash or unlock the actin-myosin contact. It's the relaxation phase of the muscle that requires energy.
Exactly.
So now, if you imagine anybody who's done that, sit on the rowing machine for 4 minutes and go as hard as you can, well, at the end of that, anyone who's done it will acknowledge it feels like you can't actually contract your muscle. You've lost the voluntary ability to make them do what you want to do. And it's really two things going on. It's this hydrogen poison, and then on top of that, you're not generating enough ATP to hit all of those fibers that need to be uncoupled from their actin and myosin. So anyone who's been there knows, like, you think I'm going crazy. Why can I not make myself do this?
Yeah, and that's where maybe the central fatigue component, the brain must
be factoring in as well.
Kicking in and say, hey, dude,
slow down.
You're getting to a point that this is not physiological. So I'm going to protect your muscles. And they're telling me through different signals. One might be the hydrogen ions, which also are produced from the hydrolysis of the breakdown of ATP. They produce also hydrogen. So you have the lactate on one hand, and the ATP of the fast rate of ATP hydrolysis also produces hydrogen ions. But yeah, as you said very well, like you're conscious once, but there's something at the neuromuscular level also that impedes that. Could be at the local level specifically, but could also perfectly be that the brain says, hey, let's stop it. And one of the things that we know when people are fatigued is that there's a decrease in adrenaline secretion to protect yourself, because adrenaline, or epinephrine, we call it here in the US epinephrine, in Europe it's called adrenaline, is the major or one of the major elements involved in the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. We can talk about that later as part of the overtraining, but the adrenergic activity, it's also decreased as well when someone is in a fatigued state.
So, by the way, Alex Hutchinson's written a great book on this. Have you read his book, Endure?
I heard about it, but I haven't
It's really
read
good.
it yet.
Again, it's good for someone like me who comes into this without world-class knowledge, and I found it a very interesting survey. In fact, I hope to have him on the podcast at some point to go into some real depth on that. So now we've talked about the two ends of the spectrum, the most extreme end and the first end. Let's now get into zone 2. What's happening physiologically as that athlete or that person enters zone 2?
So the zone 2 is that now then when you start stimulating those slow twitch muscle fibers to the fullest. Let's imagine that you're in that first gear that I mentioned earlier in the manual stick car, and then you're in that red zone. And that's where the car is asking you, hey, shift to second gear. And that's where like you're forcing physiologically, because the body adapts to say, no, you get stronger at this gear. That's kind of that zone 2 is like when you stimulate those muscle fibers before you start changing to a whole different environment where you start then recruiting fully the type 2 or fast twitch muscle fibers, and therefore the different energy system, which is the glucose. So the zone 2 coincides also with what we call the fat max, which is exercise intensity at the one you oxidize the highest amount of fat. And then we can see that clearly in the laboratory, as we saw in the graph that we can show later.
Yeah, we're going to include a lot of great pictures here. So if you're looking at the show notes, there's something called the metabolic map, which is a great slide that will walk through this. And I think what's very interesting here, this occurs so often in physiology, and it's a bit counterintuitive. As you go from zone 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, 5, and 6, you're generating more and more ATP as you go up that chain. So that part is monotonic. It's increasing without stopping. But there's a local maximum that's occurring in zone 2, which is your highest amount of fat oxidation. So as you go from zone 2 to 3 to 4, you will still produce more energy. You will consume even more oxygen. Your VO2 max has not been achieved, which is your maximal uptake of oxygen, but you will now become less efficient, and you're moving to a less efficient fuel. You're moving away from this diesel example or the fat. So again, I think for a lot of people, the semantics get confusing here because you just said that zone 2 is your maximum. I mean, maybe a better way to explain it for me is zone 2 is the place at which your mitochondria are producing the maximum amount under purely aerobic conditions of ATP. Is that fair?
I would say that too. And that's where you still recruiting those type 1 muscle fibers. That's the exercise intensity where you're recruiting the most, and they had the highest stimulus.
Without tipping into the 2s. That's basically it.
And since that type 1 muscle fibers have the highest mitochondrial density, you're really stimulating them a lot. As you said before, you need to tap into the fast twitch muscle fibers. And in the moment you tap into the fast twitch muscle fibers is because the ATP demand that you need cannot be covered by fat. And you need to switch to a different fuel. And that's where we see a big drop in fat oxidation, and we see an increase also in glucose oxidation. And that's when we start seeing also an increase in lactate as well, because lactate is always, and I forgot to mention that earlier, lactate is the mandatory byproduct, not waste product, byproduct of glucose utilization. Mandatory. Every time you use glucose, you use lactate. And at higher intensity, you produce more.
Let's talk about that because, again, I think that's more nuanced than most of us would come to this discussion with. We learned in physiology class that a molecule of glucose in the cytosol is turned into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Under conditions of sufficient cellular oxygen to meet the ATP demand, the pyruvate enters the mitochondria, where it undergoes oxidative phosphorylation to make ATP, and no lactate is generated. If that ATP demand exceeds the capacity that you just described in zone 2, we now have to start turning some of that pyruvate into lactate to generate additional ATP that's faster to generate. In the first case that I described, is there still, by necessity, some lactate production?
Yes, there's some lactate production, and we can see that even at rest we have always a little bit of lactate in our bloodstream.
Which is what you said at the outset. You said if you checked my finger or your finger now, we would probably still have somewhere between 0.7 and 1 millimole of lactate. Why is that?
That's where we're trying to understand, and we believe, my colleague George Brooks and I, that lactate is a major signaling molecule, that when it's regulated, it can signal and maintain homeostasis of different metabolic pathways. It's kind of like a visa for the body, as my colleague George Brooks calls it, when it's dysregulated, as we're starting to see in cancer, for example, or we can see in type 2 diabetes. It can dysregulate different pathways. Every cell in the body produces lactate, and pretty much every cell in the body consumes lactate.
Including red blood cells, I'm guessing.
Yes, they produce a lot of lactate, red blood cells, because they don't have mitochondria.
Yeah, I wonder...
It's glycolytic mechanism.
Yeah, do the red blood cells account for most of the lactate production we see at baseline?
Not necessarily, because there's not so much hemolysis, and there's not so much activity in the red blood cells. But there's always some metabolic lactate produced from glucose utilization, because we always use a little bit of glucose, of course the brain, but that lactate escapes to the blood, to the circulation. And for us it's significant that it's always so steady also, and every cell in the body produces lactate, and almost every cell in the